Our reading this morning is from 2 Corinthians 4, verses 1 to 6. We are going to launch back with this text into the book of 2 Corinthians as Paul continues to care for this little church, this little struggling group of believers, and he reminds them of the things that are important. 2 Corinthians 4, verses 1 to 6. Therefore, having this ministry by the mercy of God, we do not lose heart. But we have renounced disgraceful, underhanded ways. We refuse to practice cunning, to tamper with God's word. But by the open statement of the truth, we would commend ourselves to everyone's conscience in the sight of God. And even if our gospel is veiled, it is veiled to those who are perishing. In their case, the God of this world has blinded the minds of the unbelievers to keep them from seeing the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. For what we proclaim is not ourselves, but Jesus Christ as Lord, with ourselves as your servants for Jesus' sake. For God, who said, "Let light shine out of darkness," has shone in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. I typically plan out well in advance the biblical text and the topic and the themes for each Sunday morning. And I always do that with an eye on the calendar pretty far ahead. I usually have a general idea of what's going to be happening as I deal with a particular text. I can see Christmas and Easter coming and the summer holidays, and I knew that the elections were coming, but there was no way I could have predicted what would be transpiring over the last couple of days, yesterday afternoon, and then late into the evening last night. We had an inkling of how tight the American election would be, but few of us predicted exactly the outcome of the process. Now, admittedly, there's a couple of things that we did see coming. I confess that I am not surprised that President Trump has not yet conceded defeat. No surprise there. No surprise at his response to the loss. In the days ahead, his team and his supporters will no doubt work with him to put a brave face on a bad situation, trying to find some way to suggest that this is not really a total loss. Now, I want to tread very cautiously in comparing the Apostle Paul to President Trump, but there are perhaps a couple of similarities this morning. As they looked at the Apostle Paul, there are many people in Corinth who felt that he had lost, that he was a loser, that he was out for the count, that his situation was completely hopeless, and everybody seemed to know it but him. Paul had worked extremely hard in Corinth to plant this little church, and it didn't seem to be a great success. Before his arrival there on his first visit, Paul had faced some intense persecutions. He'd been beaten several times. One time they actually beat him and left him for dead. He'd been marked deeply physically. He had contracted malaria on one of his trips, and that left him with painful migraine headaches and dwindling eyesight and stomach problems. By the time he arrived in Corinth with his strength weakening and his voice faltering, he wasn't much to look at. A balding old man, mocked for his appearance, with no stage presence at all in the pulpit when he preached because of his weakness. He had preached his heart out in the city for months and succeeded in making only a handful of converts in the city of Corinth. As was his habit, whenever he arrived in a new city, he began in Corinth by going to the synagogue, trying to proclaim to his own people, the devout Jews in the city, that their long-expected Messiah had finally come, but they wouldn't listen to him. The people who should have been the most receptive to his message wanted nothing of it. So Paul then turned his attention to the Gentiles and pagans in the city, and things went from bad to worse. When Paul finally left town, he left the church in Corinth as this struggling little group of believers, just hoping and praying that they would somehow survive. And Paul was branded as something of a loser. While he was away, these other false apostles had showed up, and they were everything that Paul wasn't. They were handsome, healthy young men with good heads of hair. They knew all the rules of effective public speaking. They could talk circles around anybody with a flourish in their speech that could sell anything to anybody. And while Paul had always struggled for money, barely scraping by with the necessities of life because he didn't want to take financial advantage of the people he was trying to reach, these other false apostles were master fundraisers. They could get money out of a stone. Paul had walked into town in his worn-out sandals and his second-hand coat. These masters of glitz had pulled in with their limos, their Armani suits, and their fancy silk ties. And they had quickly attracted a following that seemed to be much larger than Paul's. Now there was a success, a big, wealthy church with all the important people from the city. These were the guys who knew what they were doing. So some of the Corinthians couldn't figure out why Paul was still bothering to try. Give it up. Just go home, old man. Don't you see that whatever you're trying to do, it's just not working here? You're a sick, poor old man, and your ministry just doesn't seem to be going anywhere. Just give up and go home. I'm not sure if you've ever felt that way. Maybe some days you feel like the outgoing president sitting in the White House for a few last weeks, and the jubilant crowds are out in the streets happy to see you leave. And they all know that you can't quite admit to yourself that it's all over, and it's time to pack it up and go home. But you know, in spite of the insurmountable odds, in spite of the fact that in human terms it looked like everything was lost, and everybody seemed to realize it but him, Paul is still hanging in there, and he won't give up. And I wondered, is this a Trump thing? Is the Apostle Paul just so self-absorbed that he can't understand that his ministry is washed out, that it's not going anywhere, and that it's time to call it quits? Paul's response to the mounting chorus of those who were telling him that it was time to end this thing was direct and firm. Paul says, we do not lose heart. We do not lose heart. And actually, Paul is a masterful wordsmith. The expression that he uses is actually a play on words. In the original Greek, it actually functions wonderfully on three different levels. Paul is actually saying three things at the same time. Paul says we're not falling down, we're not quitting, we're not faltering, we're not making a mistake here, we're not doing something wrong and pointless. And after he makes that statement, he unpacks it on three levels. The first level of what he says is the obvious one. He wasn't discouraged and he wasn't giving up. And the reason he wasn't giving up is that he hadn't chosen this ministry, it had chosen him. Paul says in this act of undescribable mercy, God had stopped Paul dead on his tracks in a flash of light on the Damascus road. He'd thrown him off his horse and he turned his life upside down. And now Paul was working in a new direction, completely counter to what his life had been earlier. When some of my friends and acquaintances from my former successful business career asked me why I made this change to this completely different path of ministry, with a lot less perks in human terms, it can be pretty hard to explain it to them in human terms. At some point, I wind up having to scare them and say that essentially, God called me to this, and I have no choice. From experience, I can tell you that I can tell a lot about where they're at spiritually, because for many people, when I tell them that I left that world for this one because God told me to, they either get so scared that it ends the conversation and they don't want to talk about it anymore, or they get intrigued and they have a dozen other questions. And you know, I need people to keep asking me this question. Not just because of what it does for them, not just because it gives me a chance to speak about the gospel and about God's direction in our lives, but also because of what it does for me. It gives me a chance to hear myself say why I do what I do. Because this is what God called me to do. He's called me to preach the gospel. And whether there are 2 people here or 100 people here, I'm doing what God in His great mercy has called me to do. And whether I earn a great living at it and am surrounded by nice things in a beautiful house, or whether I'm just scraping by, I'm privileged to be doing what God in His great mercy has called me to do. And you know, for us, the same thing goes as a church. When we get a little jealous about other churches and other ministries and other groups that seem to have it all together, and they have all the money and all the kudos and all the public attention, and we're this struggling little church we don't lose heart. We keep doing what we're doing because this is what God in His great mercy has called us to do. As ministry students, when we're in training in seminary, when we first start the program, there's a lot of talk in the beginning about your sense of call. All the staff and the teachers, they want to know how you received your call. When did God speak to you and tell you to do this ministry thing? And for some students, it's a little frustrating at first because they don't quite have a clear sense of this. And some students often think they need to figure this out because it's one of the tests. You know, we're Reformed Presbyterians and we believe in predestination. And they think, it's one of the boxes you need to check off. If you're going to be a minister, there's got to be a moment where God knocked you off your moped or your bicycle and told you to do this. And if you don't have a great call story to ministry, it's almost tempting to make something up. You think people will be more impressed if you tell them that, one day you were driving down the DeCarry late at night and suddenly all the lights turned on and the dashboard started flashing, and on your car radio, God came on and says, "Joel, build me an ark and gather animals together." But as reticent as students are to discuss this sometimes, it's important because on the hard days in ministry, and I guarantee they will come, on those difficult times when it's tempting to give up, on those difficult days when nothing seems to be going right, and everybody around you thinks you should be giving up and you're not, sometimes the only thing that keeps you going is that you remember why you're doing this. Because God, in His great mercy and love, has asked us to proclaim the gospel to people who need to hear it. It's a privilege and it's an honor to do it. And we carry on. The story is told that in the summer of 1675, shortly after construction had started on the great St. Paul's Cathedral in London, there were hundreds of workers who were beginning to painstakingly mark out the land and work the thousands of stones that needed to be cut and chiseled and assembled to put that large building together under the direction of the great renowned architect Sir Christopher Wren. And these big piles of stone were arriving in, and there was a mess. And a lot of people didn't know what was happening, why all these stones were there and all these workers were there doing all of this. And so walking through the piles of what just looked like a collection of rubble, a passerby was trying to figure out what was going on. And he stopped one of the workers who was dismally going about his job with a frown and kicking stones around, and he asked him, what are you doing? What's going on here? Now, this is a bit of a paraphrase, but the man apparently said, "Well, I'm unloading all these heavy, stupid stones from that wagon, and then I have to chisel them, and then I have to angle them off and number them, and then I got to reload them on the other wagon over there, and they're going to the scaffold." A little further away, the passerby caught a glimpse of another man who was singing while he worked with the stones. He was in a good mood. He was moving these big stones and chiseling them and doing this hard work. And he asked him, he said, "What are you doing with all these piles of stones?" And the man said, "Haven't you heard? I'm building a cathedral with Sir Christopher Wren." What a difference it makes, doesn't it? Whether you're moving around this pile of stupid, dusty stones, or whether you're building a cathedral with Sir Christopher Wren. In spite of all appearances being against him, in spite of the fact that everybody else couldn't figure out why he hadn't given up yet, in spite of all of this, Paul didn't lose heart, because in His great mercy, God had called him to build the church of Jesus Christ by proclaiming the gospel. Paul wasn't moving stupid, heavy stones around. He was building the cathedral of the church of God. Now, there was an obvious rebuttal question in response to Paul's self-confidence. To anybody who was looking at what Paul was doing, to anybody who told Paul that supposedly Paul was building the church of Christ, the obvious question is, if that's what you're doing, if you're building the church of Christ with the power of God, how come you only have a little handful of people? Why aren't you more successful? Why isn't your church bigger? Why don't more people come to listen to you preach? Why don't you have more hits on Facebook? Why doesn't your latest book become a bestseller? Why does the other church down the street look nicer and bigger than yours? Why don't people respond to your message? Good question, isn't it? If you're really doing the work of God, then why are you in this corner, dark, alone, and nobody knows you exist? Well, quite simply, that's not my job. Guaranteeing the results is not my job. Do I want to make sure that I preach the gospel as clearly as I can? Yes, absolutely. Do I want to work hard to preach the gospel in ways that connects with people, that they grasp what I'm saying and that they understand? Absolutely. Is it in my power to guarantee that everyone who hears me preach will understand and respond? No, that's not my job. Paul said there's somebody at work. Paul calls him the God of this world, small g. Sometimes he's called the prince of the power of the air, and he's here, and he thinks he owns the place, and he thinks this is his turf. And when we preach the gospel, he will do everything he can to veil people's eyes to keep them from seeing it. And sometimes his job isn't too hard because there's lots of people who don't want to hear. And in our text, it says that he uses sin to veil people's eyes because people hear the gospel and they start to understand, wait. If I accept this thing, if I follow this Jesus, that means my life has to change. I have to stop doing this and this and this. And they don't want to go there. Thank you very much. Paul's expression at the beginning of our text speaks to this issue as well. In that expression where he says that we don't get discouraged, he says he doesn't falter. He uses the word for falling down. Literally what he says is that he's not failing. The gospel is not slow to progress because Paul is doing something wrong. Because even when the gospel is clearly proclaimed and explained, people don't always respond as we expect or as soon as we expect because there's a lot of stuff going on below the surface that we're barely aware of. I love the parable of the sower because it's really encouraging to me about a preacher on this issue. You remember the story. The man goes out to sow, and he goes out to his field, and he's got a bag of seed. And as he walks along the field, he scatters the seed over the ground, and he throws the seed, and the seed falls on the soil. And the farmer keeps doing the same thing. He's throwing the seed out there over and over and over again, day after day. He just throws the seed out. And it's the same kind of seed. The seed doesn't change. He's just throwing the same kind of seed over and over again. But the seed gets a different response because the ground on which it falls is different. Some of the ground has been tilled, and it's fertile, and it's watered, and it's ready for the seed, and it's receptive. And some of the soil has been beaten down. It's the path back to the barn, and there's no way anything's getting in there. And the seed just kind of bounces off the ground, and eventually the birds come and they snatch it away. Now, there's evidently two issues here at the opposite ends of the spectrum. Let's say the farmer sowed his seed, and he had a 100% failure rate. If the farmer went out day after day, throwing the seed out there, and none of the seed ever grew, and he had a 100% failure rate, he's got to start asking some serious questions. Maybe his seeds aren't seeds after all. Maybe the ground's still frozen. He has to wait till May. Maybe what you're trying to plant will never grow in this climate. Maybe the seed's gone bad. But at the end of the spectrum, it's clear that as you faithfully sow the seed, you never expect a 100% success rate. No matter how good a sower you are, no matter how good the seed is, no matter how good the weather is, there's just different kinds of soil. Paul had examined his teaching time and time again. He knew that what he was sowing out there was good seed. He knew that what he was proclaiming was the gospel of Jesus Christ. He taught it again and again as clearly as he could, as convincingly as he could, and yet his success rate was well below 100%. But it wasn't Paul's fault. He was doing what he was called to do, and the response was in the hands of God and the hearts of those who heard. So when Paul says that he isn't faltering, it doesn't just mean that he doesn't get discouraged. It also means that he's not the one who's failing or falling down when some people hear and don't respond or reject it. Our job is not guaranteeing the harvest. Our job is not to arm twist and browbeat people into the kingdom of God. Our job, the thing to which we've been called by the mercy of God, is to sow the seed to the best of our skill, to the best of our gifting from God, to answer the questions, to engage people in winsome and convincing and accessible ways that are meaningful to those who hear, but guaranteeing the result is not our job. And this brings us to a third way in which Paul says that he's not faltering or falling down. There were some who were so concerned about the lack of response that they would do whatever it took to get people to respond. They would stretch the truth a little bit. Maybe if we altered the gospel just a little bit to make it a little bit more palatable to people. Maybe if we don't keep talking about sin so much, people won't get offended. Maybe there's a way we can talk to them about the gospel without talking to them about the fact that there's sin in their life that, But how can you clearly present the gospel in all its power and glory if there's never a point where you tell people just how deeply they need to be restored and redeemed? Well, maybe if we don't insist too much on Jesus being the only way, then they won't get turned off by what they see as arrogance, and they'll be a little bit more responsive to our message. But if the message we proclaim isn't any better or different than the message they can get from anybody else, why would they listen to us? What do we have to offer? If the Jesus we offer doesn't have something that's absolutely unique, something powerful and transcendent, why would they be interested in him? Why would they need to change anything they already have if what they've got is as good as what we have to offer? When Paul says that he doesn't fall down or falter in his presentation of the gospel, he means more than just that he doesn't get discouraged and give up. It means more than just when there's no response, it isn't because Paul has failed or isn't preaching well enough, because the response depends on the heart of the hearer and the kind of soil they are. And the third thing Paul means when he says that he doesn't falter in his gospel presentation is that he is clear and direct and open and understandable in his gospel presentation. And the gospel that he presents is not an altered gospel or the light, low-calorie version of the gospel that drops or deletes the difficult pieces. Paul wasn't discouraged. He didn't get upset when people heard and didn't respond. And he didn't try and change the gospel or use tricks to make the gospel sound better. There's an interesting verb tense that I hope you picked up as we read it. It's actually almost surprising in verse 4, and the scripture speaks this way several times. Paul talks about people seeing the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. Who is, present tense, the image of God. There are several passages in the New Testament that speak about Jesus being the embodiment of the image of God. These texts suggest that when Jesus was incarnate in the flesh, he was the full manifestation of the glory of God. When he came and walked the earth and walked among us, he was the full manifestation of the Father. If you have seen me, you have seen the Father, Jesus said to his disciples. Now, Paul and the other New Testament writers, when they speak of this, when they talk about the light of the glory of God, they're referring to what happened when Jesus was here, when he walked the earth in the flesh in Judea and Samaria and Galilee. But if that's all they were referring to, Paul would have said, we saw the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who was the image of God when he walked here among us. But he doesn't refer in the past just to the incarnation. He says Christ still is the image of God. Here and now, to the watching world, Jesus Christ is, present tense, the image of the glory of God. But wait, Jesus isn't here anymore. You can't see him around the corner. He's not preaching at the local synagogue. He's not at the Atwater Market telling parables. So if Jesus is no longer physically, tangibly walking the earth, if he's no longer physically present as he once was, how are the people supposed to see the light of the glory of God in the face of Christ? How is Jesus Christ still now the image of the glory of God, present tense? Listen to how Paul ends our text this morning. What we proclaim is not ourselves, but Jesus Christ. Paul says, when we stand in front of you, We're not saying, here's the Apostle Paul. How do you like him? This is side view and front view. What do you think? What we proclaim is not ourselves, but Jesus Christ. For God, who said, let light shine out of darkness, he refers to creation on the first day. God, who said, let light shine out of darkness, has shone in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. The light of the glory of God that was displayed in Jesus Christ when he walked the earth is still displayed in him, but people can't see him directly anymore. So how can they see the light of the glory of God? In us, in you, and in me. The same God who by the simple power of his words created the world, who made light shine out of darkness on that first day of creation at the beginning of Genesis, that same God who manifested his perfect image in Jesus Christ now recreates the light of the glory of his presence in the face of Jesus Christ in you and in me. He has shed his light in our hearts that we carry it with us in our lives and in our very beings, so that when people see us, they see the light of the power of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. That's why when we preach the gospel, what matters is not just what we say. When we preach the gospel, how we say it matters a great deal. And finally, says Paul, when we preach the gospel, who we are also matters a great deal. When I was still living at home with my parents, my father wound up getting pulled into a difficult legal matter in front of the courts. The pastor of a little church in a neighboring town had started an affair with one of the ladies of his congregation, come to him looking for counseling in a difficult marriage. After several years, she gradually realized that the pastor wasn't really helping her out of her troubled marriage. He was just enjoying this affair with her, and she tried to break off the affair. The pastor responded by threatening her and threatening her kids if she stopped seeing him. In desperation, the lady had come for my dad to see my dad, who was the pastor of the little church in the next neighboring town, looking for help. So my dad helped the lady speak to the elders of the congregation. Eventually, the pastor was exposed. He was fired. Now, the pastor responded very Christianly. He sued the congregation for wrongful dismissal. And he argued to the courts that what he did in his private life had nothing to do with his work as a pastor and was none of the congregation's business. My father wound up being called as a witness in a messy case that wound its way through the courts, all the while making it very difficult to evangelize in these two little towns because all the Christians got labeled with the same stain of hypocrisy as this adulterous pastor. But the judge's ruling was interesting. It set a precedent that I understand is still referred to today. In his ruling against the pastor, the judge was very clear that what the pastor did in his private life had everything to do with his work as a pastor. I quote from the judge's ruling. He said to the adulterous pastor, "You are not a peanut salesman. You would like to think that your butcher or your mechanic or your dentist leads a good, godly life. But at the end of the day, what really matters is how well they know your car, how skilled your dentist is with the drill, or whether your baker knows how to make a decent loaf of bread without poisoning you. But when what we have to offer is the life-transforming, redeeming gospel of Jesus Christ, who we are and how we do what we do matters a great deal." Paul clearly understood this. And that's why we, like him, have no need to get discouraged. Because through the great grace and mercy of God, this ministry of the gospel has been entrusted to us to share with others, that they might see in our words and in our lives the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ, shining in our hearts, shining in our lives. May this be true of us. Amen.